Thank you for Bridge Alternatives for inviting me. And already I can tell from this morning's exchanges that the crowd is sharp. From other interactions and conversations, the crowd is convivial. Hopefully what I'll try to do is create some material here that will cause you to be as inquisitive an audience as I can imagine you can be. Now, maybe the best way to describe the general issue of what I'm going to be talking about is to go back a few hundred years and talk about the entrepreneur Frederic Tudor, who came out of Massachusetts. And he was known as the Ice King. He liked to harvest ice out of Massachusetts rivers and then sell it. And he decided one day in 1806 that the real market he needed to exploit was the tropics, where clearly they had no ice and could use some ice. So he harvested some of his cargo, put it in cargo ships, and then traveled first to the islands of Martinique, where he offered his cargo for sale. There was only one problem with his business model. The Martinique Islanders had no idea what ice was. They had no idea what a cold drink was. This concept of ice cream was foreign to them, as was the concept of refrigeration. And as a consequence, his cargo basically melted away, literally, unappreciated and unsold. And I bring this up essentially to provide one theme for my own work, which is that often the outcomes of human affairs, social affairs, economic affairs, rest not on what people know, but rather in what they don't know. That can have a tremendous influence on our lives, but often an influence that is necessarily invisible. Now, in terms of talking about what we don't know, and for lack of a better term, I'm going to use the term ignorance, what I'd like to start off with is by making three quick arguments or assertions about ignorance that'll start from the obvious to some that are potentially more contentious. And the first argument is that, our knowledge might be great individually or collectively as a species, but our ignorance is by necessity infinite. This was noted by history of the scientific philosopher Karl Popper. But also, if you take a look at the scope of what we don't know, often what you find is that the scope is rather impressive. For example, let me just give you a quick example of this. I don't know how many of you as kids played the game Boggle at all, the table game, where basically what you do is you shake up cubes in a little container and it comes out in a 4x4 array of letters. And your task is to string the letters as much as you can to form different English words. And I've actually here mapped out some words already that you can see if you chain the letters together. So you can get A, C, and T being chained together, and that's the word act, or C, U, and E, and that's the word Q, or R-O-A-D, a four-letter word that you can get by chaining the letters. And the one question I simply have for the audience is how many total English words they think are actually in the puzzle? 10, 50, 30, 100, what? I thought I heard a guess somewhere. Got a 50. Do I hear 51? Anybody want to go higher? Anybody want to go lower? Got 10, we got 50. Oh, okay, well, I'll stop there simply because actually there are 259 words in the puzzle, suggesting that of what might be out there in the world in terms of risks, in terms of solutions, well, there's much more scope out there than we would imagine. For example, believe it or not, the puzzle does contain the word redacted, it contains the word deciders, it contains the word co-edited, and it contains the word aeroduct. But I also want to point out, and I'll come back to this point, it also contains the English word acerus, which refers to a needle-shaped object, dacite, which is a type of stone, and also ored, which is a nymph from Greek philosophy. That is, if you take a look at what's out there and that which we don't know, the scope is pretty infinite. Now, mind you, I do have to give the brain its due. The average English speaker, by the time they're 60 years old, knows maybe even 60,000 words, or the moral equivalent of 60,000 dictionary definitions, which is terrific, which is just amazing. But if you take a look at all the words in English that are out there, There are over 400,000 in the Webster's Dictionary and over 600,000 in the Oxford English Dictionary. We may know a lot, and it's impressive what we know, but there's a lot more out there than we can know. That's assertion number one. Assertion number two is not about how far out our ignorance may go, but how close our ignorance begins to the geography of our everyday life. And what I'm going to argue is that that boundary line comes much more close, comes much more quick than we would imagine. The talk, I think, will give several examples of that we're often stepping from the line of our knowledge into our ignorance far more often than we think. That's number two. And number three, though, might be the most contentious. And that basically comes from simple surveys that we do from my lab. For example, in a recent survey, we just simply surveyed people about did they know common everyday financial terms like fixed rate mortgage, revolving credit, vesting, do they know what these things mean? And what's of interest to us specifically are the last three words, because 91% of our sample expressed knowledge of at least one of these terms. The only problem with these terms is that they don't exist. We made them up in my office. And we made sure that they're not on the internet. But if we ask about places like Kashmir, Oregon, or ask people do they approve of the politician Michael Marrington, what we find is people are often very willing to give an opinion even though those people don't exist, which I believe, or places don't exist, or concepts don't exist, which we believe marks the third assertion I'd like to make today, is that boundary line that I just mentioned between our knowledge and our ignorance, it's often invisible to us. We don't know when we cross it. In the cruelest irony of all, of the things we're mostly ignorant of, one of the things we're mostly ignorant of is that boundary, when we're moving from knowledge and when we're moving to our ignorance. Just to give you another example of this, this comes not from work in our lab, but from work from a friend of mine, Frank Kyle at Yale, where what he will do is he will ask people to explain how various everyday objects work, like zippers, or ballpoint pens, or a helicopter. And he gives people very specific examples of what types of explanations they might be able to give in terms of detail on a scale from 1 to 7, and then asks them, how well can you explain how well these objects work, like a helicopter, for example. And normally what people do is they'll give themselves a middling score. They'll say that they can explain to a 4 out of 7 how a helicopter works, and then Frank or his students then says, okay, proceed. Tell me how a helicopter works. And students or other subjects make the attempt, and then after the attempt, they're much more pessimistic about what they really understand about the workings of helicopter, especially when you ask them a question like, well, how does a helicopter move forward? People are become much more cautious or much more humble in their opinion about what they know after being asked a specific question. Once they hear how an expert explains it, their confidence pops right up. But the key here is that often we have a belief in our understandings about how things work, everyday things like ballpoint pens, that exceeds our actual knowledge, or other complex items like the American Affordable Care Act. For example, people believe they know how that works much more than they do after you ask them, okay, proceed. Tell me how it acts. That's the second example that this boundary line between what we know and what we don't know is something that may be invisible to us. The third example I'm going to give comes from our lab. And this happens when we survey people once again about their knowledge. For example, we might just simply tell us what year certain events happened, like what year was Apple Computer started, or what year did the Golden Gate Bridge open. But what we also do is not only do we ask them to give us their best guess about what year these various events happened, we ask them to give us brackets, an upper bound and a lower bound, that if they're wrong, should give at least an 80% chance that they actually contain the right answer. That is, give us an upper or lower bound that has an 80% chance of containing the true answer if your exact answer isn't right. And if we take and you can do that right now, actually. You can take a look at the events and maybe estimate when you think they occurred, like when was CNN founded, and then sort of what's an upper or lower bound that you think has an 80% chance of containing the true answer. And then we can see, at least in our surveys, how well people act. Now, what I've done is I've split people according to their level of performance into fifths. And if you take a look at the top group, these are people who are performing the best. On average, their estimates are off by only a year. And the bars you see contain, on average, what their brackets are that they say will contain the right answer. And the top group does pretty good. Everybody else doesn't necessarily do as good. In fact, the bottom group, on average, tends to be 50 years off, a half century off in terms of its estimates. But that's not the finding. What the finding is, if you take a look at their brackets are wider. They understand they're more uncertain about where the true year may reside. But the brackets aren't wide enough in some sense. That is, they fail to really contain the true answer to the 80% specification that we asked them. And that's shown in this last graph. Or if you take a look at top performers, they're giving us 80% confidence intervals that do indeed contain the true answer 80% of the time. But people who are performing the worst are less confident, but unfortunately they're not unconfident enough. They're far more off than they would imagine. The truth is out there. They don't know how far out there it is from where their estimates are. And this is something that's quite common in our work. This is pretty much the finding that I'm known for, which is the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is those who don't know how little they actually know. And actually, I can go a little bit further than that. They're not in a position to know. Because if they knew they didn't know, they'd be asking someone for more advice, for the correct answer, for some counsel, if you will. People at the top know how well they're doing. People at the bottom don't have the expertise to realize that they lack expertise, essentially. Okay, so that's background in terms of where the work comes from that I'm involved in. There is a wide scope of ignorance out there. Often it infiltrates the geography of our everyday lives and our everyday tasks, whether it be professional or whether it be personal at home. And the third is, unfortunately, we don't tend to know exactly where that boundary line exists. Now, towards that end, what I've been asked to talk about today is a specific form of not knowing and what impact it might have for the particular corner of the world where you do your work. And that has to do with this notion of hypocognition. And for those of you who don't know what hypocognition is, congratulations, you have just experienced hypocognition. Hypocognition is having a lack of a knowledge, a representation, either linguistic or cognitive, of some sort of concept, some sort of category, some sort of idea, for example. And let me give you exemplify a little bit what hypocognition is. Now, you are not hypocognitive of this object or this category. I assume most people looked at the screen and said, that's an apple. Now, I want to point out two things that are actually quite remarkable in your ability to recognize that as an apple within milliseconds. And that's that your brain does a remarkable job, because not only does it report to you that there's an object on the screen and give you the features of that object on the screen, it gives you the category of the object on the screen almost as quickly. In fact, it's the category knowledge, that's an apple, is there and available to you just as quickly as knowledge about that it's red, that it has a green leaf on top. That's a remarkable achievement. That is, you are not having what logically most computers would do, which is it's red, it's round, green leaf, it must be an apple. No, your brain reports that almost immediately. Category information, conceptual information. That's quite a remarkable achievement. We have to give the brain due credit for that. And it happens so easily that we miss what a remarkable achievement that is. But there's a second thing as well, which is that if you look at that object on the screen, there are a number of associations that you have with that object, information or knowledge that you can draw on. You know what this object tastes like. You know what it smells like. You know the crunch it makes when you bite into it. You know roughly how big it is. There's just a number of associations and pieces of knowledge that you can attach to this object that comes just as quickly as knowledge that it's an apple. That's cognition. That's having a conceptual representation of an object. I assume, unless you're well-traveled in Southeast Asia, that you don't have much of a cognitive representation of this. That's a durian. That's a fruit that's quite common in Southeast Asia. It's not so much common in the United States. I assume you don't know what it tastes like. Do you know what it smells like? Exactly. Those who do have a cognitive representation will never forget what it smells like, if you will. But for the rest of you, some students will look at that picture and kind of go, oh, he's playing a joke. That's not a fruit. That's actually a club from Game of Thrones. No. That's an object, but you don't necessarily have a cognitive representation that's as rich and as full as one has in the United States for an apple. Now, mind you, you don't see a blank. You see something, but what you see is not as rich and does not provide as much as information as the first object I showed you on the screen. Now, the idea of hypocognition can apply to a lot of different areas in life. It can apply to the term heteroscedasticity, for example, which some of you might actually be aware of. It's something we have to worry about in my line of work all the time. But if you look cross-culturally, there are a lot of different things that people are cognitive of that in other cultures they aren't necessarily cognitive of, or they're rather hypocognitive of. The idea originally came from the anthropologist Robert Levy in his writings about the Tahitians and how they organized their society. And what he noticed when he did his field work among Tahitians, pictures of warm places. I've been in Ann Arbor for the past few months, so I'm a little bit, is that Tahitians, to his surprise, when someone died, or when someone experienced a severe loss, they had sort of an acute period of grief. The Tahitians had that, but they didn't have any concept of the long-lasting chronic nature of grief, that after a few days after a funeral, for example, a person could be upset, but they didn't have a concept that a person could be upset psychologically due to the loss after that for a longer period of time. They just simply didn't have it. Now, occasionally, Tahitians would describe that they felt different. That's one of the words they would use. Or they would describe that they felt sick, or that they felt strange. But they didn't have the word that we have of grief. But that's okay. We don't have a concept that matches their concept of a feeling of the uncanny, which unfortunately I can't unpack any more for you since I don't know what that refers to. Or the Japanese emotion of amai, which I have to admit I'm a little bit mystified by. What amai is in Japanese culture is the positive feelings one has when one can impose oneself inappropriately on another person that you have a relationship on. So, for example, a husband may know that his wife is busy and has to go to work, but he imposes on her the duty that she has to make breakfast for him. Or she imposes on him that he has to go to the movie that she wants to go on Friday night, even though she knows that he doesn't want to. That brings about, in Japanese culture, positive feelings, not only for the person doing the imposing, but the person being imposed upon. And Americans, however, don't, in some sense, have this concept. Occasionally, they will have the feeling, but they don't have a representation for that concept. And so it's often not communicated or not even noticed. And that's what we mean by hypocognitive, not having a representation for that brings these associations, which brings a field of understanding that other cultures or experts in other fields might be very good at bringing. Just to give you another example, I look at that chessboard and I say, oh, it's the beginning of the game, period. For those of you more knowledgeable, you would immediately recognize that this is the Sicilian defense that Black has chosen, and you already know something about whether Black intends to win the game or to draw the game. You have a pretty good idea about whether or not White's response is to be aggressive or not aggressive. To the rest of us, well, it's a chessboard. It's the beginning of the game, but we don't have those associations because we're not aware of everything that might be going on. And towards that end, I think this leads me to the first lesson, or the first point or observation I'd like to make about hypocognition, which is you can ask, well, what is it like to be in a hypocognitive state? Well, sometimes you'll recognize that you're in a hypocognitive state. For example, this is a sentence I've been playing around with because in the 1990s it had meaning, but I don't think it has meaning now for anybody in Gen Z. And certainly 50 years before the 1990s, it didn't have meaning. But it's one of my favorite sentences I ever read. It was basically put on a post-it on a computer, which basically said, do not reboot with a system floppy. And some of you may be old enough to know exactly what that means. Others of you may not remember all that. And you know that seems to be somewhat of a mysterious sentence. That happens sometimes. But often what happens is you can be experiencing hypocognition or in a state of hypocognition and not knowing that you're in a state of hypocognition because, well, what you see is what you get. You look at the world around you or look at the thing that you're thinking about and you can perfectly assign a meaning to it. You don't realize that you might be missing, in some sense, the real meaning to what you're being presented with. For example, and by the way, I don't know if these examples are about to work. These are new examples for me. So if they work, yay. If they don't work, you'll be the only audience who exclusively ever sees these examples. But I like finding out what song lyrics are really about. Because often what you find is what you think a song is about turns out not to be anywhere close to what a song is about. And so I chose two examples from the work of Sir Paul McCartney. Let me just give you the first one. And the first verse of Got to Get You Into My Life out of Revolver. I was alone, I took a ride, I didn't know what I would find there. Another road where maybe I could see another kind of mind there. Ooh, then suddenly I see you. Ooh, did I tell you I need you every single day of my life? Well, that's perfectly understandable what that lyric is about. He's lonely. He sees someone that he could potentially love, or at least lust over, and it's sort of love at first sight. So I don't know if anybody knows what this song is really about. This is Sir Paul's tribute to marijuana. This is actually the only song the Beatles ever wrote about drugs. And when you take a look at it, suddenly you realize, oh, I can see another kind of mind there. I get it, okay. That is, to me, I don't know for you, but to me the lyrics suddenly changed cast and what they're really about quite a bit. That's number one. Number two also comes from Sir Paul, where blackbird singing in the dead of night, take these broken wings and learn to fly all your life. You were only waiting for this moment to arise. And obviously it's about a friend who's had a tremendous tragedy or some sort of difficulty, but they're recovering, they're getting to it, they're about to fly once again. That's my interpretation of it. I don't know if anybody in the audience knows what this is really about. This is really his tribute to the civil rights movement among African Americans in the 1960s, which really sort of does bring, excuse me, different interpretations, at least for me, about what the lyrics really refer to. Blackbird singing in the dead of night, take these sunken eyes and learn to see. All your life, you're only waiting for this moment to be free. That is a different song, once I have an idea of what the concept really is behind it. So observation number one is the issue with hypocognition is when you're in that state, you may not know that you're in this state because everything seems perfectly understandable. Everything seems perfectly coherent. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, I'm just going to show you that shade of blue for a few minutes, and I apologize, I'm in the University of Michigan, so that's what you get as an interrupter. Okay, so I showed you that shade of blue. Now what I'd like to do is give you basically a panel of shades of blue and see if anybody would like to guess which was the specific shade of blue I showed you originally. You're going with what? All the way to the right? Oh no, all the way that way. All the way this way. Okay, we got one there. Any other guesses? Fourth from the right. So this from here, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Fourth from the left. Hey. We're not getting, yay, we're not getting any agreement. And I could be cruel and say, yeah, one of you is right. It actually is fourth from the left. So, but here's the point that I want to make. The point I would like to make is actually compared to a Russian speaker. And do you, who's the person who got it right? Do you speak Russian? Okay, because that test is much easier for a Russian, because we have the concept of blue, but Russians break up blue into a finer grained set of categories. They have, I don't know Russian. If anybody knows Russian, please save me right now. But there is Sini and there's Goluboy. Sini refers to darker shades of blue. Goluboy refers to lighter shades of blue. I chose something right at near the break of the two shades. And essentially, in experiments where Russian speakers and other languages that have this distinction, people are faster and much more accurate in being able to categorize and remember and report colors relative to those like us who have a more omnibus concept for this range of the color spectrum. That is, we're hypocognitive, and as a consequence, it turns out for us to be more difficult to track accurately what's actually happening in the environment when we encounter it in our environment. Yeah. No one has taken a look at red and pink as far as I know. Well, that's just, and I'm surprised because often that is exactly the comparisons that's made, that we have the distinction between red and pink and other languages don't have that. But for some reason, no one, as far as I know, has looked at the reverse order, or I would show it, for example. But very good point. But what it does suggest that even sort of noticing some things in the environment often require having a concept of it. In this work that I've been doing in hypocognition, my graduate student, Katie Wu, and I have been spending a lot of time dealing with esoteric concepts. And one of the esoteric concepts we once discussed and continue to discuss is, and you'll see why once I tell the story, is the idea of shoe-beariness. And what shoe-beariness is, you can't get it from the term, is the concept of feeling the heat of another person when you sit down on a chair that's recently been sat upon by someone else. Which I can attest, I had never experienced that before, and I told Katie I'd never experienced that before in one meeting, ran off to the Detroit airport, sat down on a seat, and went, oh. And now I can't help but noticing it every time I sit down in the seat that has recently been occupied. It's a little unpleasant for me. I hope it turns out okay for you. But tracking things in the environment really often does require having a concept for it, and we miss things that we simply don't have a concept for. Let me just give you a quick example, which is, let's imagine we did a study where we showed you various types of cheeses at various different frequencies. Like one of these cheeses we showed you at 4 times. One of these cheeses we showed you 2 times. One of these cheeses we showed you 0 times. The report I can give you from psychological science is one of the amazing things our brain does is it's very good at counting up frequency. It's very good at counting up frequency even when you don't have, it's not an explicit task. Doesn't matter what your IQ is. Doesn't matter the type of thing that you're asked to count or you're asked about in the account. People are very good at tracking frequencies. Well, we wondered to what extent that really did depend on having a concept for the thing that you might be tracking. So what we did is we took cheeses and then we took dumplings from various types of dumplings from Chinese cuisine and asked British respondents, basically, and we would show either the cheeses 4 times, 2 times, or 0 times, or each of these specific types of dumplings, 4 times, 2 times, or 0 times, and saw whether or not not knowing what the dumplings were actually impaired this amazing ability that the brain has. And to be fair, what we also did is we did the reverse experiment with a number of Chinese respondents as well. Because they know dumplings, they don't necessarily know blue cheese from cheddar cheese from Swiss cheese, for example. And it turns out, if you take a look at the accuracy with which people reported the number of times we had shown them these various objects, the first thing to tell you is people did underestimate. People do underestimate. But if we took a look at the British, they showed more sensitivity in being able to track the frequency of the cheeses, the things they had a concept for, than they did of the dumplings, something they really did have very little conceptual knowledge of. Meanwhile, the Chinese respondents showed the exact reverse pattern. They were much more accurate in their tracking of the various types of dumplings we had shown them, not so much of the various cheeses we had shown them. That is, knowledge may be important in order to track even the most fundamental pieces of information that our brain is tracking out there in the world, and one of those is frequency of occurrence, frequency of encounter. It is an amazing competence our brain shows there. But another observation to make, however, is that having a concept can have other impacts on what people do, or rather what they fail to do. Now, this is a question about compound interest that was asked in the 2015 version of the FINRA the National Financial Capability Study, in which people were basically asked, if you owe $1,000 in a loan and the interest rate you're charged is 20% per year compounded annually, if you didn't pay anything off, when would the amount double? And the correct answer is at least 2 years, but less than 5 years. But if you take a look, only 35% of Americans actually answered that question correctly. And if the brain is very good at counting up the frequency of things, it's not very good at understanding compound interest. It is astonishing how much resistance you find among people in their ability to comprehend the idea of exponential growth or compound interest. And it does matter. And as you can see, only about a third of Americans, and this is a representative sample, were able to answer that question correctly. And it matters because if you take a look at people's behavior, what you find is it is related to their financial behavior. Namely, those who understand the idea of compound interest, that is, they answered the question correctly, are 9% more likely to pay off their credit cards in full. And those who don't answer the question correctly are 7% more likely to pay only the minimum during the course of a year. And given the fact that we're talking about 25,000 respondents, this is the difference of about 2,000 people producing each of those two figures. And this is independent, by the way, of education, income, or other questions about financial literacy. That seems to be something that matters. Hypocognition does have an impact, or at least a relationship, with what people do in related matters. This next, yes?
I mean, the ability to understand compound interest would almost unequivocally be associated with education and intelligence.
Right.
Control for that factor? And then
we controlled for education. We don't have an intelligence factor. But we controlled for education. You still get the difference. And we also controlled for answer right on all the other financial literacy questions that people were asked. So we don't have intelligence, but we do know what they do know about financial literacy. Do they understand inflation? Do they understand diversifying, for example? And if you control for all of that knowledge, you still get an impact on this knowledge about this specific concept. So we don't have intelligence per se, but we do have at least their knowledge, a test of their knowledge for financial literacy in general. Those numbers aren't, but you basically get the exact same numbers back if you do. So yeah, if you adjust, you get 59.50 basically. So, but the table I read off, I know that, but the table I read off was the unadjusted numbers. So technically that's the accurate answer to give. Well, let's see if there are any other quick questions about that. I might be going, because I want to indulge you before I let you indulge me. And that has to do with another area in which hypocognition may matter, more in my corner of the world, but perhaps in your corner of the world as well, which is we do live in interesting times. And one of the things that does seem to be a trend in these interesting times is people are less likely to listen to experts compared to how much they used to listen to experts. That is, people are more willing to dismiss what their doctors say, maybe what their financial analysts say. Certainly, I've met a lot of people who dismiss what I say. And the question is, what might be behind it? Well, and this actually turned out just to be timely. Matt Moda and his group last year did a survey of 1,300 respondents, and 36% of them stated they knew as much or more than doctors about the causes of autism. And a full 34% of Americans stated they knew the same relative to scientists in terms of the causes of autism. And that mattered because, and Matt Moda called this response to be overconfidence. The overconfidence was related to actually the lowest level of knowledge about autism and its and the causal agents responsible for it, and also the highest level of misinformation about the causes or the origins of autism. But it was also related to behavior in the sense that people who were overconfident tended to be more opposed to mandatory vaccination, and also endorsed the role of non-experts in being involved in the policy debate. And I just bring that up now because obviously, as of last week, we're at a record peak for the last 20 years in terms of a measles outbreak that's happening in the United States. Now the question becomes, where does this overconfidence or this discounting of experts come from? And in this case, it's my neck of the woods. It's people who are doing some sort of biomedical social research. Well, what we find is that some people do distrust science, and they're open about it, and you can ask them questions about it, they're willing to report it. What it's correlated with, though, what's interesting about what it's correlated with is that it's correlated with what people think data is or are all about. That is, a lot of people know that scientists deal with data, but if you ask them what the role is of data, basically they say the role of data is, well, the scientist comes to their conclusion, and then they get data to ornament or to illustrate their conclusion. But the data do not inform or in any way constrain what a scientist says. Whereas from my neck of the woods, I can tell you absolutely what data are, what are the scientific rules we have to live under to collect data and to analyze data. There are an amazing number of constraints on what we can do, so it really does constrain what we can say or what we can ultimately claim. But for many people out there, they have the belief that scientists can say whatever they want, and that's related to less trust in scientific motives and less trust in scientific expertise. So you can ask where that comes from. Well, we had a suspicion, and we thought it may come from whether or not people know there is such a thing as scientific rigor. That is, that the collection of data comes under certain very stringent rules, such as, for example, Dr. L is testing an herbal remedy for headache. She recruits about 110 people to her study and gives them a particular kind of a tea packet. She instructs them to drink that tea the next time they have a headache, and in the end of the study period, all participants report that their headaches went away within 2 hours. Dr. L concludes that the tea is an effective remedy. Is her conclusion warranted? Oh, by the way, is her conclusion warranted under basic scientific rules? Absolutely not, because? No control. Good, okay. Number 2, Dr. A is conducting a study about labor times in US hospitals. Women who sign up for the study choose whether they receive an epidural or whether they give birth without one. After they give birth, Dr. A finds that 40 women who received an epidural had labor that lasted 50 minutes longer than the 43 women who did not. He concludes that epidurals cause labor to last longer. Is his conclusion warranted? Sorry, let's say they did the statistical analysis and there was a difference. There's no causality. There's no causality because there's no random assignment. The women selected their condition. They weren't randomly assigned to condition. So that's a no-no. Dr. A could never get that published. There is a constraint in what Dr. A can say. And I just have to applaud because I talked about 3 weeks ago to a group of philosophers, and this one was really iffy. They did not know about this one. What may seem straightforward to some people in terms of what are the rules of scientific rigor aren't necessarily, there are many people who say both those scenarios are absolutely okay. The scientists can claim whatever they want to claim. That data is good enough. And it turns out that if you take a look at the correlation between people knowing about the rules of scientific rigor, being cognitive, if you will, of the rules of scientific rigor, that's strongly correlated with this belief that scientists can say anything. To the extent that people don't know the rules, and it's okay for the scientists to say whatever they want to say in the scenarios, for example, that I presented to you, they believe that scientists can say anything, and they disbelieve scientists. And that basically leads to that causal model which is basically knowledge of scientific rigor seems to be relevant for believing that there are constraints on scientists, which ultimately leads to trust in scientists. So that's the way in which things can matter. Now, I'll go through the rest rather quickly, but in some sense the rest might be the most pointed observations to make, because one of the issues with hypocognition is that it may lead people to have to rely on hypercognition, that is, the concepts that they do have, and to potentially misapply and to apply too broadly the ideas of what they have that are out there. And so what I want to talk about are what are some pointed issues to be aware of when the issue turns from hypocognition to hypercognition. And in particular, because what in this group, clearly one of the major aims that people have here is trying to come up with a model or set of models that's going to predict the future. You're well aware of uncertainty and risk and whatnot, but how do you come up with a model to actually slay as much as possible the uncertainty that you have in front of you? One of the issues that one can have is, well, our brain is really good at coming up with models. Let me give you an example. Hopefully the sound will be working for this.
Let us ask you a question. What do you think about the storm, the risk to your own safety at this point? I'm sorry.
Oh, backstory. This is a little before Hurricane Irma hit Florida in 2017. This interview is taking place at Miami Beach.
What do you think about the storm, the power, the ferocity, and the risk to your own safety at this point?
Well, at this point, I'm very relieved to discover that as we speak, the eye of the storm is practically due south of us by 220 miles, okay, because it's crossing the 80th meridian, which is 80 degrees west longitude. So I'm not so worried because it's so far away, and it's bearing as of 8 p.m.
Westbound.
Well, not just westbound, it was 275 degrees. That's only 1/15 above due west toward true north.
Is he right?
So this thing is moving and has been moving in a very westerly direction, and because it's several hundred miles south, the risks are less and less. I'm not worried. I don't think it's going to get much worse than what we're seeing right here.
Thanks.
Okay, 12 hours later, the hurricane did hit Miami Beach in a direct hit. Here are some pictures of the aftermath. And this is not to make fun of the individual, but maybe to make fun of all our brains, because our brains are very good at coming up with stories to deal with novel situations. It's part of the reason why we live. It's hubris, however, to think that the brain is always going to deliver a model and a conclusion that is correct. And the problem with the models or the conclusions the brain can deliver is often they seem just as plausible when they're wrong as when they're right, as in this case. For example, this comes from work we've done where we've just given people a simple quiz, let's say of intuitive physics. And let's say I've got this curved piece of pipe I've laid flat on a table, and I shoot a ball in one end, and then the ball races out and exits the other end. Which trajectory do you think the ball takes when it comes out of the pipe? Does it come out in trajectory A, trajectory B, trajectory C, or trajectory D? I won't ask. You can just say which one you believe is the right one. According to modern physics, the correct answer is C. It'll just simply go straight. Though if we were having this conversation in the 1600s, all of us would have said A. And about 30% of the American population does say A. Now, this is important because let's imagine we ask 6 questions like this and we track how many people get right, that's the x-axis, versus how many they think they're getting right, that's the y-axis, based on the answers that they give. And if you take a look, what you find is you get a little Cheshire cat's smile of a curve where people who are getting these questions right, they know the trajectory is straight, or at least that's what they report, are pretty confident that they're getting it right, and they're right about their being right. The problem is there's another subgroup of people who are just as confident that the ball will have impetus, will curve, continue to curve once it comes out of the pipe. That actually turns out to be incorrect, but they're practically as confident in their answer based on the concept they have, as are people who are getting it right. And so that's a problem in some sense with hypercognition, is that it can leave you with confidence exactly in a situation where you potentially might be showing the opposite of competence, if you will. The second thing that may matter in terms of hypercognition is that, well, if it's the thing you're used to, it's usually the thing you're going to conclude. That is, professions are well known for concluding that whatever problem you have, well, what you have is the thing exactly that our profession was designed to deal with. For example, Schulberg in 1985 monitored patients as they were being sent to a primary medical care facility or to community health center, and he basically took objective measures of how much they were showing depressive symptomology, were they showing signs of depression, and then just looked to see to what extent they were being diagnosed with depression as they went to Center A, the primary care facility, as opposed to the community mental health center. And what he discovered was not a surprise that people were more likely to be diagnosed with depression if they went to the community health center than if they went to the primary medical care center. And the other thing he knew is, based on their symptomology, that represented a overdiagnosis on the part of the community mental health center and an underdiagnosis on the part of the primary medical care facility. Doctors would tend to give diagnoses that were aligned with their specialty, even when those diagnoses were false, if you will. That is, that people will tend to see that which they have been trained to see, that they're hypercognitive of. By the way, you also see this in terms of recommendations for prostate cancer. Let me just explain what this graph is. This is a graph looking at various levels of severity, progression of prostate cancer, and whether or not you are whether treatment is being recommended by a surgeon or a radiation oncologist. And what you basically find is that the surgeon tends to recommend surgery at all levels of severity, and the radiation oncologists tend to recommend radiation at all levels of severity. That is, people will tend to see that which they've been trained to see or that which they're the most comfortable with. This has a term that I love because it's one of the few times French has ever been introduced into modern psychology. This is known as déformation professionnelle, deformation of judgment due to your profession, if you will. That's observation number 2 with hypercognition. Observation number 3, and this one I think may very well be an important one for those dealing at the outer edges of modern finance or modern edges of anything, which is that what's interesting to take a look at is how the material I'm talking about today interacts with being a beginner, being a novitiate, being introduced to a concept or an idea or an opportunity for the first time. It turns out that beginners are very cautious. In fact, by any measures that psychologists use, they tend to be appropriately cautious. They tend not to be overconfident. But give them just a little experience with something, just a little knowledge, just a little learning, and their confidence goes from 0 to 60 really, really quickly. And this is shown, sticking to the medical domain, in a study done by Chatlow, where he's looking at the number of errors that surgeons make implanting screws into spines using robotic arms. And what his team discovers is that at the beginning, doctors are very careful and they make very, very few mistakes. The screw goes where it's supposed to go. A rank beginner surgeon doing this is one of the safest surgeons around. But after 10 surgeries, after maybe 15 surgeries, the errors begin to come. And the errors begin to come probably because of overconfidence. And you can see the black shows you sort of the graph of errors as they happen. Anybody who flies a plane knows this. You're not your most dangerous with only 50 flight hours. You're most dangerous at 800 flight hours, for example. But we've been studying this in our lab where we've decided to turn people into doctors and put them in a post-apocalyptic world in which they have to diagnose zombie diseases. And we do that because it's the only way to keep people's attention through 60 different patients they have to see, and they stick with it. And we basically give them no training. They can do whatever they want to do to try to figure out how to diagnose these patients. We show them accurately. But if you take a look at the graph on your left, that's the confidence versus accuracy graph, the straight line is basically what happens with people's accuracy. People become incrementally better at the task as they go through practice with 60 patients. The dotted line, however, is what happens with their confidence. Note as beginners how they start off cautious and appropriately cautious. But it only takes about 20 or so instances of experience where suddenly they become much more confident than they are accurate. They wildly overpredict how successful they're being. In some sense, they're taking a little learning and turning it into something of a dangerous thing, if you will. They're overinterpreting the successes that they're having. They're overfitting the data that they've been given in only about 15 to 20 trials, for example. But note that this is an issue of dealing with new things. One goes from hypocompetent, if you will, to hypercognitive and hypercompetent very, very quickly. And by the way, you can find echoes of that in people's financial self-beliefs. Once again, if we take a look at FINRA surveys and analyze data, what we find is that there's a tremendous explosion in confidence, that's the raw ratings, in terms of what people think of their financial knowledge, going from being, let's say, teenagers to young adults. Then their confidence flatlines for a long time before it begins to pick up again during their senior years, while all the while, in reality, their actual financial competence or financial literacy is slowly climbing up. So the young are often, compared to their elders, much more overconfident in what they know about the financial world. That I believe is observation number 3. Oh good, I have just enough time for observation number 4. The last thing to worry about when dealing with hypocognition versus hypercognition. What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically tap out a tune and see on my microphone and see if anybody can recognize what the tune is. Okay, so I'm not talented musically, but I'll try the best that I can. Can anybody recognize the tune I'm about to tap out? That's right, the Star Spangled Banner. That's excellent, because here's the issue. When you do an experiment like that, people doing the tapping tend to believe that 50% of the people are going to guess that right. The real answer is only 2% actually guess it right. Why? Because, well, we're like the apple, we have all those associations. We hear the orchestration behind it while we're tapping. All the other person hears is, and that's it. And one of the problems that all of us have as experts, scientists, financial people, doctors, physicists, whatever you name, politicians, is often we overestimate how much other people know and how easy it is to communicate to them what we're trying to communicate to them. We may have lots of things to say, but all they hear, for example, is ginger because that's the one thing that they know. The one place, once again, where this is the most evident is in medicine, where if you ask nurses how literate in health their patients are, they tend to wildly overestimate how much their patients know and how well their patients understand the instructions that they've been given. And that's shown by this graph, essentially. Nurses would be scandalized, for example, if they knew how few of their patients actually knew where the kidneys go or where the pancreas is. People are much less literate than experts will tend to believe, because once you're hypercognitive, it's just fairly obvious. Everybody must know it. Psychologists refer to this as the curse of knowledge. Well, I've gone over. You've been very indulgent. Let me just give you a quick summary. If you've noticed, I've spent an hour, I would describe it, what psychologists refer to as admiring the problem of hypocognition. The difficulties that it might bring to us as in the human race or as professionals. We still have a panel coming up, which hopefully will bring this closer to your home, and also talk a little bit about solutions or possible ideas to circumvent some of the difficulties I've talked about here.